Yes, it's starting. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Jiming Sun. I'm the host for this AI for Healthcare webinar. I'm also a computer science professor. I have a joint appointment at the Carl, Illinois College of Medicine at University of Illinois. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Brad Malin, this Accenture Professor of Biomedical Informatics, Biostatistics, and Computer Science at Vanderbilt University. And I know Brad for a long time, and his research in is involved the development of trustworthy AI methodology and infrastructure. And he's a PI for many large consortium on AI technology for medicine sponsored by National Institute of Health, including AIM Ahead and Bridge to AI program. And among he also got many different honors. He is elected as a fellow of National Academy of Medicine and the American College of Medical Informatics, and also the American Institute of Medical and Biological Engineering Society's fellow, and also the fellow of IEEE and International Academy of Health Science and Informatics. And beyond many of his prestigious title and groundbreaking research in AI for healthcare, and because I know Brad personally, I also know he is known as a great collaborator and a very kind and supportive mentor to his students and his uh, everybody who worked with him. So if you're students that want to work in this space, definitely reach out to Brad, and he has been a great mentors for many. There's only one caveat. Many students never left his group, so keep that in mind. I mean, they did graduate and they did find a great job, but they decided to stay at Vanderbilt and continue working on this line of research with Brad. So with that, floor is yours. Welcome, Brad.
Wow. Thanks, Jermaine. So for those
Oh,
that are wondering, yeah, go ahead.
one last thing I want to say, this particular webinar is actually jointly sponsored by the Healthcare Engineering and Science Center at the UIUC. I think the center director, Jim Ray, is also here. Jim, you want to say a few words as well?
No, I can't add anything, G-Ming. I mean, you captured it perfectly. Just delighted to have you here, Brad. Looking forward to your talk.
Good to see you, Jim. Wow. Okay. I can't believe that you called me out on the students. It's not that I like hate them. It's just that they become,
Yeah,
faculty and
willingly.
do great things. They just don't want to leave my group. That's right. All right. So let's start talking about what I want to talk about today. So I'm talking about AI and the notion of it as a life cycle, right? And so I think that we're going to see that there's lots of ways in which responsibility can either fail or become very enabling. But I wanted to start by thinking, or at least just making it clear that what we're going to talk about is AI in a broad sense, right? Like we may be talking about machine learning mostly, but typically we're talking about like the historical approach to AI, which is, we're thinking about predictions, which is that you've got some type of a model that you've built off of some data, and then you're going to ask it a question. It's like, is it A or B? Is this individual at risk for readmission if I discharge them, or are they not at risk for readmission? Right. And this is the way we've like typically thought about AI for like the last like 75 years. Um, Over the last couple of years, I think everybody's become really excited about the notion of generative aspects of AI, so that you're no longer in this closed world environment where you know what exactly it is that you're asking the system to do, and you can adjudicate whether or not it's correct. Instead, we're asking it to potentially be creative. So as an example of this, we had this paper earlier this year that was trying to figure out if we could do zero shot applications of LLMs in particular to see if we could do drug repositioning. And we were specifically looking at Alzheimer's. And so we were asking asking ChatGPT, so give me the 20 most promising drugs to replace to be repurposed for the management of Alzheimer's. And so we were hyper specific with our prompting. We said, we want you to exclude drugs that were originally designed for Alzheimer's. We want you to be like very particular with respect to the ranking. And then we took what came out of this LLM and we checked to see how well it understood things that might be happening that might not be on brand. And so we went back to Vanderbilt's electronic medical record system to see if the drugs were actually being used with individuals who had Alzheimer's. And we did that at Vanderbilt. And then we also did this in this large cohort study that the NIH has sponsored for the last couple of years called All of Us, which at the present moment in time has about 500,000 individuals who have contributed their medical records and genomic data. And I just want to give you a little bit of intuition into like what we saw. And so, first we saw, you're going to see like these hazard ratios for VUMC, All of Us, or AOU, and we did a meta-analysis across the two to see if we could boost up the signal. And we saw a couple drugs that ChatGPT came back with, and it said, like we only saw these at Vanderbilt. We didn't see these really showing up in people who were volunteering for All of Us. And so we wanted validation across these two places for generalizability. So we said, okay, this is interesting. It's giving us some hits, but the variance is all over the place. We had a drug where it showed up in both, right? But it was not statistically meaningful. It was not significantly associated with individuals who had Alzheimer's. And then we ended up having a couple drugs where things like simvastatin, which is a statin, you'll notice that we were very much close to being on the right side of the hazard of this ratio of 1, right? And so simvastatin hit at, it was on like a 0.05 level. And then we had minocycline, which was hitting, but we were only seeing it at Vanderbilt. What got really interesting for us was that we had two particular drugs that seemed to be hitting pretty well in both systems, right? And on the meta-analytic side, it was statistically significantly associated with management of Alzheimer's. Now, the thing is that so losartan and both metformin, there is not real strong literature on this, but we were seeing that it was picking up on some of the factors associated with these drugs, and it was really giving some surprising recommendations to us. So this was really surprising to us because this was zero shot. We then said, okay, well, if you can do that, could you do clinical phenotyping from electronic medical records? And so what exactly does that mean? So we're interested in looking for individuals who have either type 2 diabetes, or in this situation, we're looking for dementia or hypothyroidism, just very different types of disorders. So we were trying to get pretty good coverage on the different types of things that an individual could be diagnosed with. And we were asking these LLMs, we were looking at GPT and Claude and Bard, could you define the set of criteria that would tell us whether or not an individual hits on one of these phenotypes? Now, some of these are easier than others. Hypothyroidism, you might think is easy, but it's really intriguing. Like some of the symptoms associated with hypothyroidism get confused with things like thyroid cancer. And so when we took a look at what the responses in terms of these phenotype specifications, which would say, look for this type of a lab, look for this type of a med, look for this type of a diagnosis, it's a combination of them that make up the phenotype. We then went back to human adjudicators and we said, how well were these systems doing? Give us on a scale of 1 to 3, 3 being best, 1 being worse. And you can see GPT-4 seemed to be doing pretty well, better than GPT 3.5, better than Claude, better than Bard. No offense to Google, but Bard has not been so great. This was before Gemini was coming out. What was interesting to us was that these systems they seemed to be doing decently for hypothyroidism, also for type 2 diabetes, not as great for dementia. But where things got really intriguing to us was, again, we went back to Vanderbilt's data to check and see how well these things were actually working when we had these 3 cohorts. They were already defined, so we had these patients. And what you can look at here is this is the recall on these populations of around, like 100,000 people with dementia, sorry, 3,000 people with dementia, 9,000 people with type 2 diabetes, 2,000 with hypothyroidism. We looked at recall versus false positive rate. And you can see that in this situation, like, with the recall's pretty good for hypothyroidism, but you can see that the false positive rate really starts ticking up when you start looking at 3.5 as opposed to 4. Okay. The only reason why I'm pointing this out is that this, once again, this is zero-shot application of these LLMs to try to facilitate clinical research. And it seems like it's feasible, but there are some times where you can see where it just falls apart entirely. It really died on T2D. It got a lot of confusion with T2D with type 1 diabetes and other complications. Okay, so this is just an illustration of what you can do with like generative AI. All right, now you can also ask it to be very prescriptive. So that was an illustration of give me a phenotype, but I can also say, look, I've got a patient. This guy just had heart bypass surgery. We put him on warfarin and we're going to discharge him. Could you give me some directions? And ChatGPT is great at this, right? It gives you like things about like how to take your medication and manage your medication. It'll give information about, it will give information about diet and nutrition, physical activity, and then it will just go on and on and on, right? And I think that for those of you that use chat, you realize that it can be like very verbose and you have to tell it to like, make things a little simpler. But what's notable about this is that it's really a long set of guidelines of what should be done. But then you have to ask this question of, well, hey, ChatGPT, can I trust you? Right? It's a really interesting answer that you get back from chat, right? So chat will say, look, I'm an AI model. I don't have personal biases or motivations. My responses are based solely on the information and data that I have been trained on, but it won't tell you what information it has been trained on, right? And then it says, but look, I'm not infallible. And so it's always a good idea to verify the information I provide and consult with other sources to ensure accuracy. This is I love this. I mean, like ChatGPT just sounds like a lawyer. It's like hedging like all over the place. Right. Okay. So, I'm talking about like responsibility. And so what exactly does that mean? So let's think about what happens with the AI lifecycle, right? A lot of people think of this in terms of we build a model, we evaluate that model. And that's what I just showed you guys with the zero-shot application. It's like, okay, does this thing seem to be working well? And if it works well, then we might use it or we might kick it into practice. But you also have to ask this question of where exactly did the model come from, right? Like, was the data good? ChatGPT said, verify my sources. It's like, well, I don't know if I can verify your sources. So what we'd like to do is like model this entire workflow, which is that you get a model, you backtrack and you say, well, where was the data? And then you have to recognize that this data comes from people, right? Either people uploading things onto the internet, or in the case of like medical records, this is data that is coming directly from patients. So, you check to see if all the things are good. Like, did I have like a good relationship with my population? Does the data seem to be representative? Is my model going to be functioning well? And if it doesn't, you take this feedback loop, right? You basically take a step back and say, do I need to go back if my model's bad and get better data? If my data was bad, do I need to go back and change the population? And this entire process, this is this whole notion of making AI. This is one part of the life cycle. This is like the making AI. The flip side of it is that you now want to use the AI. And so I live in a medical center and you want to transition this stuff into implemented systems, at which point you use this model to generate knowledge about a patient, right? It's like, I want to predict whether or not this person's at risk for re-identification, for readmission or not, right? And then I have to take some action based on what this knowledge is. And there may be a recommended action, like, so, okay, yeah, they're at risk for readmission, but this is what you should do for them. And then you have to ask the question of, well, is this generalizable? So I learned a model at Vanderbilt. Can I transition over to another hospital and have that model still working? All right. And all of these require checkpoints. And if it fails, then you have to really ask this question of like, so what exactly do you do to this pipeline? So we published a paper about this a couple years ago where we talked about this as, human-centered AI. And we weren't the first ones to really talk about it, But we talked about it in the notion of this life cycle about how you really need teams that are of diverse individuals that have different skill sets and different knowledge so that you can do like a 360 view on whatever this technology is that you're developing and then putting out into the world. And so we broke this down into the design, develop, and deploy, or you can think of this as design, build, and implement, as some people refer to it now. And so we took this to heart when we were building a couple of these large NIH programs that Jimeng was alluding to. One of them is the Aim Ahead program, which is this program that's trying to diversify data sets and diversify the population of people who are building medically centered artificial intelligence. And as a part of this, we created what's referred to as the ethical AI or the applied ethical AI team, and are taking these principles and putting them into practice in this environment. We were also able to convince the NIH that this notion of ethical and trustworthy AI needed to be embedded in all new data sets that are being created for their grand challenges. And so this is now part of the Bridge to AI program. And so this is embedded in, what I'm going to show you is embedded in the 4 large data sets that they're in the midst of creating. As part of this, we also published a paper that talked about what it means to take these principles and put them into practice, not just define them. And it was really intriguing. So we did this under a Delphi study through Aim Ahead. And what we learned was that there was a lot of confusion around terms. People didn't always understand what bias was. They didn't understand what fairness was, even what equity was when we're talking about AI. But more importantly, what we were learning was that there were just how we thought systems should be developed was very different than what we were actually pursuing. So this notion of co-creation as opposed to dictation became really critical to what I'm about to show you, because the notion of dictation says that you have a company that says, I know what problem I want to solve. I'm going to solve it. But then you have like a community that looks at this and goes, that's not solving our problem. Why did you even build this? Okay, so let's talk about how these principles relate to what's going on within the life cycle. Right? I'm going to show you a couple of examples of what can go wrong when you don't take these principles to heart before I show you what works. Okay, and so one of the first things that can happen is this notion of trust management. And if you break trust, you don't even get to build these pipelines. And so a lot of this comes back to the notion of just like, who are you collecting data from and how are you going to be putting it into this life cycle? And so like the first cautionary tale is this notion of like, there's data that exists. It doesn't mean that you get to use it for anything. And I think that this has become pretty evident with the establishment of ChatGPT and a lot of people starting to question, did you really have the authority to put that data into this model? Right, but this goes back way further. And so the example that I'm showing you here, this has to do with a set of Native Americans known as the Havasupai tribe. And so about 10 years ago, there was a situation in which there was data that was collected by the University of Arizona. It was collected so that they could study metabolic disorders within individuals from this tribe. And the data ended up being reused by the university for purposes that were beyond the scope of consent. And this was just because the data was on the shelf, and it even went through the institutional review board, and they were not completely aware of all the limitations. This ended up leading to a massive lawsuit. It was a lawsuit that the University of Arizona lost. And you had a very clear teachable moment here, which was that you have to recognize that data are about people. And they are from particular individuals that come from particular communities, and they have particular cultures. And so just because the data exists, it does not necessarily mean that you should disrespect the expectations of the populations to the individuals that have contributed to it. And so there's an issue here that between like the law of what is legally permitted versus what might be morally a harm. Or moral wrong. Right. But I really just want to impress upon you the fact that a lot of people think of it as like it's data and data and data, but in reality, it's without people, you've got no data. All right. And so this has become an issue in a couple of other settings, right? We have extremely large data sets that are being created that people aren't even aware of. Right. One of the largest is this claims database that is marketed by Meritive, which I will readily admit I'm a paid consultant to, but Meritive used to be IBM Watson Health. And so this is the largest claims database that exists in the country. And people don't consent to having their information put into this claims database. But this is a de-identified environment, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And so it's considered legally viable. There's also situations though in which there's questionable business practices and maybe business acceptable, but there's also questions about whether it's what people really understood. The best example of this was Google's relationship with Ascension Health, where Google entered into a relationship with Ascension. Ascension is one of the largest healthcare providers in the country. They have over 50 million patient lives that they serve. And Google was provided with the opportunity to create AI technologies for them to facilitate in diagnostics as well as scheduling. And there was a whistleblower within Google that said, "Hey, it's really a little strange that we're being given fully identified medical records on everybody, as well as fully identified information on all of the care providers." And then Congress began an investigation into this back in November of 2019. And mainly the reason why this was shelved and why the investigation kind of stopped was because the pandemic hit a couple months later. Very questionable. Not saying they've done anything wrong, but it's questionable. The one that I really want to hammer in on is this company called Coco. And if you're not familiar with Coco, Coco was this online mental health support company where an individual could come in and say like, "Hey, I'm not having such a great day. I'm looking for some assistance and some recommendations." And so a couple years ago, Coco said, "Hey, we have this new thing, CocoBot. Would you be okay with, instead of directly interacting with a human mental health professional, you ask your question to the bot, and the bot's going to tell you just what you're supposed to do." All right, so that doesn't sound so horrible, but then you have to ask the question, but what exactly was CocoBot? And this is where things got interesting, because basically what happened is that somebody would go to the site, they'd ask a question, and then they would not answer the question directly. They would send it to their bot. And it turns out that their bot was ChatGPT. And this was before chat had really set the world on fire. It had really just come out. And so they got a response from ChatGPT, and then they provided potentially a modified answer back to the individual. Now, why is this considered potentially questionable? So Coco was a non-for-profit that had a relationship with the consumer. The consumer did not agree to having their information sent over to a for-profit like OpenAI, or allowing OpenAI to continue learning based on their information, right? So there's a transparency issue here, potentially a contract issue as well. And this did not sit well in the media once it was discovered that this was ChatGPT. Basically, you had this backlash that said, "Look, this is a horrible experiment. We don't know if the information that's coming back from ChatGPT is verifiable, is usable. We don't know if this is going to be helpful." And it was kind of dismissed by the CEO, where they basically said that this was just a misunderstanding, and this is just a questionable practice. All right, so again, I've been harping back on what happens back here with people, but let's think about what happens when we get to the data, right? So when we're doing work in the machine learning space, we're very much interested in just who is the population that we're doing a study with. And I think that at least in the genomics community, it's become very evident that the data that we've collected over the last couple of decades has been heavily focused on particular populations. What's notable is that we've seen people try to diversify the publications associated with which populations are being studied, right? And this was a study that we did for the All of Us program. And so what we saw was that the studies were becoming more diversified, but the data sets that they were being based on were not diversifying. And so they were just changing the focus. And why that becomes an issue, that's a representation issue, but this turns into the algorithmic fairness problem, which is that when you're going to do a study, when you're going to build a model on a particular population and you apply it to that population, typically it works pretty well. right? So this is just an example where they built a model off of a European population. They checked to see if they could predict something about Europeans and ancestry. And then what happened when you took the model that you learned off of Europeans and then tried to predict information about Latin Americans? Didn't work nearly as well. Same thing with South Asians. It got worse with East Asians, and it got really bad when you tried to transition over to African Americans and people of African descent. Right. And this is basically a fairness issue, right? So you have a model that's not performing as well as it should for every subpopulation that you're trying to apply it to. So this is a good illustration, but where it can have potential major ramifications, I think was demonstrated well by the study by Ziad Obermeyer and Sendil Malinahan, where basically what they showed was that you had a situation in which a model was making recommendations on what to do for patients when they were discharged from the hospital. And this discharge, it was a recommendation on if an individual should be offered some type of additional support after they left. Now, one of the problems was that the likelihood that you were going to be offered this particular service was dependent on what your insurance was. And so people who had better insurance were more likely going to pay, and therefore they would be offered this service, right? And that was considered to be the outcome. And so there was a correlation. White patients ended up, in general, having paid more through their insurance. And as an artifact, the machine learning model inferred that whites just needed more care than blacks. And it was really not an artifact of their race. It was really more of an artifact of the insurance that these individuals had. And so there's a very clear teachable moment on this one, which is that you really should check for correlations that obscure causality, right? This is the model just should have included insurance status, but it didn't. So based on this, some weird stuff has happened in the world, particularly as AI has become more front and center. One of the things that has been advocated is that maybe you should just not collect certain types of variables that are considered to be sensitive. And one of the examples of this is that, and this is actually something that's happened in France for a long time, which is that they just try not to collect race and not use race for decision-making purposes. Problem that they ran into was really demonstrated in the context of the pandemic, which was that there was one point when they were collecting race, and that was when individuals died. And so they had the ability to detect the disparity, but they were detecting it way too late, right? And really the point here is that you don't necessarily tell a system ignore a variable. You would want to use the variable to calibrate the system or to determine if there is a disparity such that you can go back and try to address it. All right, but then the question is, so what do you do, right? What are you testing for? And so there's this great paper that John Bian and Fei Wang put together a couple of years ago that said, here's all the different ways in which you can test for algorithmic fairness, right? And so they told us about what all the great toolkits are, the Kushvarni's group and AI360 over at IBM, great tool, right? Various types of things going on. And then they said, but there's the problem of we talk about fairness, but there's many different ways to define fairness, right? You could have equal opportunity, you could have counterfactual fairness, you can have fairness through unawareness, and which one are you supposed to optimize for? Because if you try to optimize for all of them, chances are you're going to run into some bigger challenges. And so this has become one of the big open questions, I would say, in the field, which is that no single one of these is going to really be the one that rules them all. So this starts to beg the question of, well, if we have a fairness problem, then what are you supposed to do to address this issue, right? One of the problems that we know we run into is that one of the reasons why these bias problems happen is because there's either insufficient data on a population or they're just not sufficiently represented. And so we've been asking this question, well, could we make records for them? Well, I say we, but this was actually something that Jimeng had hypothesized almost a decade ago. And so, we're like, okay, well, it's not like we're the first people to come up with this idea. It's not a new principle to try and create synthetic data. We've been doing this since the 1970s, but it's really that deep learning methods have helped us to create things that appear to be representative of the real data in ways at a scale that we were never really able to do before. And I think that this was really kickstarted probably about about a decade ago when Ian Goodfellow's team was inventing the concept of GANs. Right. And so it's really funny. So Jermaine comes to me, he's like, hey, I've got this really great idea. Do we think we can do this? And so we're like, okay, well, let's see if it works. And so we said, could we take GANs from continuous image processing data and move it into categorical data? And so we did this, and then did evaluation with data from Sutter Health and from Beth Israel Deaconess's data set, Mimic 3 at the time. And we said, so let's learn a model on the patient's demographics, their diagnoses, their procedures, and their meds. And then let's just see if we can use this to predict, to generate new records, and then see like, well, do we generate clinical concepts at the same rate and in combination that we saw in the real data? And so this is just an analysis where you can compare real versus synthetic in terms of its rate. But this is a typo. This is real versus real. But if you do real versus synthetic in terms of the rate at which certain things happen in the synthetic data, right? This was basically what we saw with variational autoencoders, and it was under generating a bit for some of the more rare phenomena, not exactly common. But when you shifted this from the VAE and over into the GAN, and the first system that was created was what was referred to as MedGAN, you can see that the system aligns significantly better. So that gave us a lot of hope. Not and as we were doing that, there was also evidence that came out that you can use that type of data. You don't just have the ability to generate synthetic data. You were getting evidence that showed that if you injected the synthetic data into the real data, you had the ability to achieve augmentation and improve the accuracy or the performance of the machine learning classifiers that were being built. And so that set us on a whole long series of studies. One was to develop better training and evaluation methods. And particularly, we realized that one of the reasons why these systems looked great on paper, they looked great superficially, but they weren't doing that great once you started looking at latent dimensionality. So if you stop, instead of just saying, do you have this diagnosis or not have this diagnosis, we started looking at the principal components that exist in the system to say, is the topology of the data representative? Right. And so that helped to make the system better. It was also around that time that we shifted over towards Wasserstein distance functions. And as soon as things turned into WGANs, things really fell into place. But we also ran into the situation where we had this problem where we could generate anything, right? The GAN is meant to be mimicking real life, but it can do some really weird stuff because it tries to generate anything. And you can have a situation in which you would end up with medical records being generated where you had women with prostate cancer. And so Chao Yan, who Jimeng was referring to some of the people who stayed in my group, brilliant researcher, he started working on ways to probabilistically embed constraints into the ways in which the networks were learning. And so we couldn't guarantee this hallucination was not going to happen, but we could show that we could heavily mitigate it. And then where things got really interesting was we went away from static models, just the profile of the individual, and said, could we profile this individual over time, right? So go towards longitudinal medical records. Okay, so there's a whole long history that I could talk about with GANs and synthetic data generation, but what I wanted to highlight is that they're not perfect, right? So as we were doing this type of work, there was also research that showed that you could do zero-shot inversions against these types of systems. And the best example of this was with images that were being processed, where this is an example of the fake image. And then this is an example of all the real training data that went in. And what you can see is that the fake data is looking not just surprisingly, is not just similar, but it's extremely similar to the real data. Okay, so this is So what's going on here, right? So this is where I say this is where machine learning is kind of goes boink, right? And what exactly is happening is that there are times when you can just have mimicry with these synthetic data generators, right? And part of the reason why this can happen is that if you don't have sufficient training data, then you can end up in a collapsing situation, and you can just end up with a model that is just like it is the original data. That's not so difficult to test for, right? But where things get a little more tricky is you can have situations in which if somebody knows some of the features about somebody who might be in the training data, then you can use this to give a test of whether or not they were actually in the training data. And so you could say, okay, well, this is what I think the training data would look like versus what random data might look like. And then you can test if it's more likely to see somebody in the data set that built this synthetic data. All right, and that's what's known as a membership inference. Membership inference is not a direct disclosure. It just says somebody's in this data set. But you can have situations of what's referred to as attribute inference, which says that I now have a couple factors about you, and there's something I don't know about you. So like I might know your demographics, but I don't know if you're HIV positive. And so now I make a prediction, and I can show that if you have like a very high confidence of being HIV positive, but I wouldn't have known that otherwise, that's an attribute disclosure or an attribute inference. And where things become really problematic is if you have the combination of membership and attribute inference. So if I can show that somebody's in the data set and I can show that I can learn something new about them, this is where disclosure occurs. So there's no simple way to prevent these things from happening. And so we, instead of trying to guarantee that this was not going to happen, because these models are extremely complex, we instead built a evaluation criteria. And so we built a benchmarking toolbox. And so we put this out there that allows people to test for the various types of privacy intrusions, as well as what's the data useful for, the utility. And so we published this in Nature Comms late in 2022. Okay, so this was an opportunity, right? This was a situation in which we're like, okay, we have a responsibility to try to build better data sets to try and ensure that we don't have unfair models. Okay, but you then have to ask other types of questions. So I gave you an illustration of the privacy problem, but let me show you where the worst privacy problem comes into play here. I think LLMs are fascinating, and I also think that they're really dangerous. And so like there was a study that was done back in 2021 that said, hey, this is GPT-2, everybody pay attention to it, this is going to change the world. But there's a really weird thing that happens that when you submit a prompt to this thing, that when you hit a certain type of prompt that has repetition associated with it, the repetition can end up prompting the system to spit back out information that looks, well, it is the training data. And that's just because the training data is getting embedded in the deep, very, very large parameterized system. And so what they were able to show was that that if you took a look on information theoretic sense, you would see that the majority of the data, well, it seemed to have like it was in the sweet spot of the network. It looked as though it was it was relatively normal. But then there were these like weird examples that were like popping off, and they were just like out on the fringes of the distribution. And these were the things where you were getting things like the names of people whose data went into the training, as well as the contact information. And so this was really intriguing. This, as I mentioned, came out, this was a study that was done late 2020. And so then you would think that when GPT-4 came around, this would have been a problem that had been solved or at least addressed. And nope, that was not the case. And so where almost the exact same type of attack was executed against GPT-4, where Catherine Lee's group showed, now let's just say like, hey, here's my prompt. Poem, give me an answer. And GPT was like, hey, book. And then all of a sudden it starts transitioning into some like really weird stuff. And it starts including like the names of individuals and actual dates and things that are just like, it was weird. Basically, what happened was that this thing was because of all the parameters. Typically when you're training these systems, you're overwriting and overwriting and overwriting, and you're just tuning like the statistical, like the numbers that are in there, right? But what ends up happening is that if you don't have enough data, and you don't necessarily overwrite the actual training data, it just gets stuck in like the little crevices in the network, and then you can reconstruct it. Here's the problem. Nobody's figured out how to solve this one yet. All right, so this is still a problem that exists in GPT. Okay, so you can also have hallucinations. I gave you an illustration of a hallucination where I said, look, women with prostate cancer, it shouldn't happen. But what's notable about that is that we do have illustrations where the medical record is indicative of it's a woman with prostate cancer because it may have an error, or it may be somebody who they were a trans individual. It could happen. It's just really rare, right? But you can also have situations where the hallucinations just they don't come from the training data. Best illustration of this is the study that came out from Adam Wright's group right after ChatGPT came out, and they gave ChatGPT all of these examples of this is like not real patient data, but here's an example of the type of patient that I want you to make a recommendation for. And then it would make a they would say, here, give us the recommendation, they would adjudicate it. And along the way, they ended up coming up with this weird recommendation that came out of chat, and it said, hey, you should give this patient etanafagood. And they were like, oh, well, that's interesting. What is etanafagood? And it was nothing. It wasn't even a real drug, right? ChatGPT was just like, hey, this is something that you should give. And they were like, oh, okay, that's weird. Now they didn't do it in this paper, but in subsequent work, it was shown that you can have ChatGPT say, hey, here's a drug of interest. And then you go, well, that doesn't seem weird. Could you please tell me where that recommendation came from? And then ChatGPT fabricates a paper to justify its claim. So based on that, so we started doing some research. My team started working with some people over at Intuit because they were seeing similar types of problems in recommendations within TurboTax. And we were like, okay, well, maybe like, how do we address this problem? And so one of the ways in which we address this problem is through just semantic rewrites and checking in the system, where basically what we do is we force the system to give us answers over and over again, but we're changing the way in which we're asking the question. And so basically what we're doing is this cross-checking, and then we're checking for consistency in the responses that are coming back. And this is, we can just ignore this. This is the my line is better than your line graph. Okay, so there are ways to address hallucinations. You may not be able to prevent them entirely, but you can certainly test for things that appear to be strange. But there's still this question of like, so if we're going to take these tools and we're going to use public tools, right? Like we can build our own machine learning toolkits, but some of these tools are just going to be way too big for us to build, and we're going to work on like just fine tuning. We still have to ask questions about whether or not what the commercial industry is building for us is still going to be useful over time. There's this great paper that James Al's group published last year where they looked at what happened to GPT over time. And just as an illustration, this is what you would expect. So this is the prime number question that I think a lot of people are familiar with, where you're asking chat, is this a prime number? And this is notoriously difficult for LLMs to address. And what you can see is that with GPT 3.5, between March 2023 and June 2023, it got significantly better, right? Great. That's what we want to see, progress, right? This is the proposal that everybody's coming up with that says AI is going to get better. It's going to change the world. GPT-4 got worse, substantially worse, right? It's not like it was like off by like a percentage point. Like it was off by 35 percentage points. It just got dumber, right? You may have also heard the story about ChatGPT passing the US medical licensing examination, right? Or exam. And so this is a hard one, right? You can see that GPT 3.5, it didn't really change between March 2023 and June 2023. But GPT-4 again got dumber. It's not always getting dumber. In some things it gets smarter, and in some things it gets dumber. And I haven't done the research on this yet, so this is just me totally pontificating. My expectation is that this is what happens when you're trying to use an all-purpose AI environment to try to solve specific problems. And when you train it on one particular problem or try to boost up its capability in a certain direction, it may lose its ability to optimize for other things. So, so this is the issue of reliability over time. And then, there's other problems that we could talk about that I just think people need to be aware of and test for as they're building these systems, which is just, are these systems explainable? Are they usable? Can you actually act upon what is being told to you? And, do you have context? The context issue is really big. I'm not going to spend any time talking about this, but there's really this question of like, if I take a model at location A and then run it over at location B, is it going to work as well? And the chances are it's not. And you're probably going to have to do some type of a proof of concept or some type of a test or continuous evaluation before we can trust that systems can just be used either out of the box or transferred. Okay, a couple of thoughts to close this out. I think that what I've explained to you is like there's opportunities for addressing these issues of responsibility and reliability. I think they're extremely complex. I also don't think that we know all of them at the present moment in time. And I think that we just need to be prepared to address them as they're coming out. Um, I also think that these things are going to take a really long time to address. Um, one of the reasons for that is like just I don't think there's a simple way to always solve the fairness problem. Part of the problems with bias and fairness or representation problems is that we really do have systemic inequities that and especially in healthcare, that if we show that an algorithm predicts better for one group than for another group, it may not be that we need to get better data. It may just be that we need to change the way that the healthcare system works. And so, there's these questions about, yes, we want fairness, but there may not be points at which you can get to a completely fair system given the way things currently work today. Okay, regardless of that, I don't think that this notion of ethical inquiry with AI should be done downstream, right? What I showed you was lots of examples of where we look back and we go, shoot, we did the wrong thing. Some of this stuff we should be able to recognize from the outset, and there should be discussions that we have before we actually end up in this situation. All right. I'm going to stop there. There's a lot of people that have worked on this work over the last couple of years, and so I thank them all here. I'm sure I'm missing people. And if
Cool.
I left some time for question, so we can have a discussion or quick Q&A, or you guys can all like yell at me on email or
Thanks.
X. Yeah.
Thanks, Brad, for the wonderful talk. I mean, for everybody on the call, if you have a question, please type in the chat or just speak up. Jim, you want to go first?
Sure. That was really great, Brad. Thanks so much. I was curious if you could speak to how like carefully curated validation data sets and kind of testing processes might fit into this, even if the problems are not, even if it's not clear how to solve them. Is there a story that we could do a better job of detecting problems? And could this be like eventually like a battery of things that all models have to pass,
Yeah.
almost like a scorecard or something?
Yeah, without a doubt. This is actually a conversation that Leo Sully and I have been having for a while. Um, I think there's a series of evaluation criteria that we need to define for the entire life cycle, like pre-model development, while models being developed, and then when the model's actually out in deployment. Um, the 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 problem with data, though, is I think that if you have a well-defined problem that you're trying to solve, and the data is very clean, I think it's going to be great. What I'm a little worried about is trying to develop some of the AI technologies or even refine LLMs to do things in inherently messy environments that we're not going to have a simple way to just clean the data. Um, so like I think for your problem, like if we have like really well curated MRI or CT or PET scans, it's going to be like great. I think we got an opportunity. Where I worry is um, current clinical documentation, like natural language notes, are a mess. And we have this expectation now that we're going to solve the documentation crisis and like the burnout problem with all of these clinicians by allowing GPT or some version of an LLM to just, learn off of like everything that people have been writing historically and then write their notes for them, right? And I worry about this because I just the data is really bad and there's no simple way of cleaning it. And you're trying to solve a problem that's open world. And this is going to be, I think there's an opportunity. I just don't think it's going to be a simple one to solve.
Okay, cool. Anyone else have follow-up questions? I have a long list, so I mean, if you guys probably want to go first. Um, I think Joe, you had a question. Uh, I can read this from the text. Do you have a sense of the impact of memorization of yeah, I think
Oh
intellectual
yeah.
property that may be part of the training data set? So yeah, I think that's something if you can comment on, like,
I think we could all comment on it. I mean, like that's the thing. Like I think it's pretty clear that if you end up with memorization of the underlying data, if there's a copyright issue associated with it, there's going to be some massive problems in the future. Um, I will tell you, uh, so I've definitely been approached by several large academic medical centers who have had big tech companies come to them and have asked to use their data for the creation of new types of technologies, new types of AI. And then the question that comes up, can this organization prove that the training data is not memorized, is not embedded in the AI or the fine-tuned foundation model that's going to be brought out of that system. Right now, the answer is I can't do it. And and so a lot of these data managing organizations are basically just saying, sorry, we're not going to share data at this point because we really don't know if like 6 months down the road, 1 year down the road, somebody's going to come up with some crazy prompt and our data is going to be popped out. And so that's that's a problem. So in terms of evaluation criteria, I think that if you guys are looking for interesting research projects, I think that the number one thing that, well, it's not number one, but it's number one on my list. The number one thing is going to be creating some type of audit trick capability for models that are coming out of repositories of data to determine whether or not there is memorization, or some type of an inference disclosure. But I
so
will say this: I think OpenAI is going to lose their lawsuit, uh, and they're going like the Sarah Silverman lawsuit, and I think they're going to end up losing a lot of money.
do you have a follow-up question, AJ? Or
Oh, I was the Sarah Silverman case is going to be a lot closer because they can't produce an exact copy, even though the argument they failed in that initial phase and the motion to dismiss was partially granted, and now they're backed into the corner saying, well, training based upon data on the internet was an infringement, and so that is
yeah,
a slippery slope. So I'll agree with Brad's ultimate conclusion that if you go to the New York Times versus OpenAI, they've got a much stronger case because they've got an
Yeah.
exact copy, and they worked on the prompt to make sure they got an exact article out. So that is copyright infringement based upon as they're traveling with it. And there's a few other cases in between, John Grisham, which I could distinguish. But I think Sarah Silverman might be a little bit more challenging. But Brad's fundamental premise is that we are struggling in the AI industry to have provability and auditability. And right now that's creating flux in the in both the legal paradigm as well as provenance of data and all of the spectrum, if you will.
I'll take the
I have a
CMI
follow-up.
examination. I'll take the partial pass.
I have a follow-up question on this training data part because a lot of computers, I mean, I guess non-legal folks, right, that they want to, technology folks want to train some LM with public available data. I think probably all those LM are trained with some internet data, right? They'll probably all have some IP infringement in that sense, if that's a infringement. Like Meta, I mean Google, I mean everybody, right? So probably all training a similar type of data. Is that a something has to be allowed at this point because of the result? Like the model is so valuable, and if you prevent them from training with internet data, that's or what do you think? Like, or they will just fight just
I
like
don't, this could be a very long discussion because I don't think there's a correct answer on it, right? Like I think there's some of the data that's on the internet is public domain, right? And some is not. And everything that's in the public domain, you're basically going to be able to argue that they have the ability to train on it and the ability to use it. Anything that's not in the public domain, if it's behind a paywall, if it's behind some type of an environment where you have a robots.txt file that says you're not allowed to crawl through here, I think that it's going to be very difficult to argue that that data is too valuable to not be used for the establishment of AI. I'm not a legal authority.
Yeah.
But I think that would be what I would expect. I do think though it's going to be very difficult. This is one of the reasons why I think OpenAI doesn't care. I know this is going to go on the internet. I have friends that work there, but this is one of the reasons why I don't think OpenAI cares, which is that once the technology has been built, it's going to be very difficult to say that that technology is not going to be used. And so like, this is a situation where it's like, you shouldn't do it, and then you build it. It's like, all right, well, it's now available. Now everybody's using it within their services. At that point, it could end up turning into a too big to fail situation, right? Where it's like you now have technology that everybody uses, and you're not going to just say turn it off because that technology shouldn't exist. But I don't think that you'll be able to argue for the creation of new technology because the technology will be so important. But I think it will be difficult to rip out existing technology. And I think that's what OpenAI instituted when GPT came out.
So I have
I'll add a
follow-up.
comment from the legal standpoint. Yeah, so I'm an engineer by background, but I practice in the intellectual property law space of it. Into how do you pronounce Mr. Sung's question is, and so just as a policy level, if something's available on the internet and anyone can go read it, is there an infringement? Let's just specifically say copyright infringement for reading it. I mean, when you, Mr. Sun, read something on the internet, would you be viewed as an infringer? And everybody kind of agrees to the answer to that is like, well, no. Well, so using a computer to read it also, I would make the argument is not infringement. So the policy kind of, if we take it at a level of saying merely reading it, in my opinion, is not the infringement, and it should not be alleged to be the infringement. I know that's where a couple cases are going with it because they got backed into a corner, but the challenge seems to be at that level of saying, well, wait a minute. And Brad's point is if you got a paywall and a contract, then you're actually violating the contract to get behind the paywall to do that. So that's another violation. But at its core, if you're sharing something on the internet, that's not what copyright is necessarily intended to produce. It's intended to protect, my apologies, the reproduction of that exact same thing. And so as long as an LLM is not producing the reproduction of that same exact thing, then that's why I think the argument that to train AI on stuff that's publicly available is strained. To Brad's point is when it's in the public domain, you wouldn't say that that's copyright infringement. So why is sharing it on the internet also just the next evolution of that? So, but yeah, Paul.
Thanks for clarifying that. Although this LM is this non-deterministic process, right? I mean, reproduce, it's not something like with the right prompt, a lot of things can be output.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jailbreaking of LLMs is a fascinating problem, right?
Yeah.
Like, so I don't, I'm not convinced that you could build an LLM that is going to be guaranteed to be protected, and it's completely protected from generating something that you didn't want it to generate. The reason why I'm a little concerned about that is that I agree with you, Meg, on this. Like, so if you have a situation where you tell the LLM do not reproduce the original text, but now you end up with text that looks like highly similar to that text, and following this. So like imagine that you could infer what was the text that it was based upon, right? And somebody goes, look, I didn't want that in your training. I didn't want that in the repository. And you can now prove that it's there. At that point, could you ask them to erase it? Right? Like, could you unlearn it from the system? That's like, to me, probably going to be problem number two. Like if I work on my like pantheon of problems, like number one is model audit. Number two is that now that you can audit, what right or what ability do you have to tell an organization you need to erase this information from your training data because it's producing things that I don't want it to produce?
Interesting.
I don't have the answer to that one yet. Unlearning is still very new.
Yeah, very interesting. So I know we're run out of time. I always ask this as the last question, Brad. So what advice do you have for, I mean, our students or new researchers in this field? What problem they should work on, or any
Should have asked
secret?
me too.
Would you record this? A lot of people will still see this.
Yeah, what problem should we be working on? So I think I gave the two that are the big ones for me at the moment, right? If you asked me to do it, I'll give a recommendation, not so much a big problem to work on, which is that if anybody wants to work on health and AI, that working with the data by itself only gets you so much intuition. And one of the things that I do with my students is that they all have to go out into the hospital and do rounding at some point. They have to have some type of an interaction with the environment in which that data is being collected and or the model is going to be applied. Because the data is not completely representative of what's going on in the real world all the time. In image processing, it is, but when you're talking about clinical EHR data, it's not always completely representative. So making sure that you get exposure into the real environment gives you way more intuition than what you get just from working with the data. That's the number one recommendation. All right.
Cool.
Thanks a lot, Troy.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Yep.